Okay, my clock says noon. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for logging on. I'm sure a few folks will be logging on over the next few moments. I just wanted to say hi and thank everyone for joining and give a very brief welcome before handing it over to our amazing junior board member and the moderator of today's discussion, among many other things, Shantae J. Edwards. So my name is Haley and I'm the full-time development manager for PowerPlay and one of the folks who worked on putting this event together along with the whole team that I'm very grateful for. I'm really glad that PowerPlay is hosting this event and would like to sincerely thank our panelists today and our moderator and PowerPlay's junior board for putting this together, specifically a few of our members who worked really hard to make this happen. And of course, all of you attendees for making today happen as well. So please enjoy the in-depth, meaningful conversation that is about to ensue. Please ask questions during and towards the end of the conversation via the chat. And just two quick administrative notes. Jen from the PowerPlay team will be helping monitor questions. But as soon as we start in just one other second, if you can hover over someone like myself or Jen whose video is off and hover over those three buttons and select the hide non-video participants, it'll make it a better experience for you as a viewer. And I will now pass it over to the fantastic Shantae J.
Thank you, Haley. I appreciate that. So shout out to that. Also, Haley, you said something as we were putting together this event about today. And I wanted you to share that for a moment before we get started. Like, what's in kind of like a historical fact of what's happening or what happened today?
Yes, that's a great question. So I happen to have, I'm not in Brooklyn now, I'm in Buffalo, but in my Brooklyn apartment, I have a calendar from The Nation, which showcases just various different events throughout history. And it just so happens that today, October 15th, is the date that the Black Panther Party was founded. I think the 1960s, but so that feels very significant.
And so here we are making history again. Thank you, Haley. I appreciate that. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our two panelists who are thought leaders and advocates and just basically doing the work. Brittany Brathwaite and Corey Ponder. And what I also want to put out there too is that today's conversation is going to be like no other. So I'm going to challenge you all as you are receiving from these dope individuals to, if you're taking notes, take some good notes. And toward the end, when we have the Q&A, to offer up some questions that you are pondering now. I mean, Corey Ponder, I had to throw that in there, right? And making sure that in this space that we are in a safe space. We are in an opportunity, this is an opportunity for us to take our work to the next level. So if you feel uncomfortable, shout out to you. If you are comfortable, I want to push you to get into an uncomfortable zone, because today's conversation is going to require you to shift your mindset. And so without further ado, with my two amazing panelists, or our two amazing panelists, Brittany, Corey, tell us a little bit about you and what you do in the world.
Okay, thank you, Shantae. I guess I'll get us started off here. First and foremost, so excited to be here with you all this afternoon. I'm on the West Coast, so so is Corey. It's actually early morning for us, which makes it a true honor for us to be here. And so about me, there are a lot of things that I could tell you. I like to start with the fact that I'm a Brooklyn born and raised girl. I've been living in Brooklyn my entire life, and that has deeply shaped my political and ideological views about how I see the world. I have been working with young people in organizing spaces, leadership development spaces, education, out of school time programs for over 10 years. And with a deep focus on the lives and experiences of girls of color and gender nonconforming young people, especially those located in New York City. These days, I am leading a sexual education and wellness firm called Kimbertive, which centers on empowering Black women and girls to lead sexually healthy lives, and have them be at the front of their lives and their healthcare and their wellness. I also work with a consulting firm that does diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work called Rebellious Root. We are a cooperative, and it's really important in the spirit or legacy of Ella Baker for me to name that we're a cooperative, and we equally participate in the work that we do and build for our diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And I also, you can find me thinking around the CUNY Grad Center. I am currently studying to become a critical social psychologist. And so lots of work that you will hear me talk about later, but that's sort of my dig. 10 years in the youth justice, reproductive justice, and gender justice world and space. Corey?
Awesome. Oh, I'm already excited, just everything you said about your background, to get deep into this conversation. So good afternoon, but morning for us. My name is Corey Ponder, as Shantae said. I am also out on the West Coast, currently in Oakland. I am originally from Atlanta and grew up there before going off to school, first in Nashville and then out to the Bay for my master's. Was very interesting, and I think also relevant to this conversation today and how I think about showing up both as an ally and my understanding of this conversation in this space is I remember really thinking about, as a Black man growing up in the South, that I had a very good understanding, I think, of what it meant to both be different in spaces and also to be the diverse person in the room, right? So my identity as a Black man very much shaped the way that people saw me, particularly within systems or institutions. And actually coming out to California at that time, you know, almost 10 years ago, was my first time going west of the Mississippi River. I remember really being surprised at what diversity actually meant, because even as a Black man, there were so many things I didn't understand about other identities, about the way other people move through the world, about how the world affected them. And so I think that this conversation and the reason why this work is so important to me, thinking about allyship and thinking about how we show up for others and how we hold ourselves accountable, is really just understanding that we all have that room and space to grow. And so I think a lot about that in the work that I do, which is centered mainly on how do we build inclusion through this idea of empathy, right? So the more that I can do to understand people's experiences and the more that I can try to put myself into those positions of understanding, the more that I can increase my own capacity, both for awareness, but also then change. And so excited to talk a lot about that. I currently run a business, Impact Strategies, where I do this work as a consultant, as a facilitator, and a workshop designer. And also a lot of that work has been informed by my experiences just in different industries, working for 6 years in federal government space as an analyst on counterterrorism issues, and then shifting into tech, where I spend time now as a policy advisor focused on privacy. So a lot of different lenses that I've looked at how this actually works or applies in spaces that people occupy every day.
Absolutely fantastic. So all of those receipts, y'all hear that? They got the receipts, which is going to make for such an amazing conversation. So thank you for allowing us to be in this space with you all, and you all are doing the work. And so in doing the work in this conversation about allyship, I want to know from the both of you, what does authentic allyship mean to you? And why is it important to hold others accountable? Brittany, you can start off.
Unmuting myself is one of my biggest challenges to date. So thank you for that question, Shantae. So, I mean, everyone who knows me knows my interesting relationship with allyship, because I want to push people beyond allyship to be an accomplice. And the definition and the terms really don't matter. But for me, allyship in its most authentic place, which is to be an accomplice, is about relationship for me. I think that when we are allies, we are constantly in a place where we're thinking about our relationship to other people in the world. And so that is having like a deep critical analysis of our privilege, our power, where we stand, how we look and see the world, critically always reflecting on the world, and having that, not just thinking about it, so not just depositing a whole bunch of knowledge and keeping it here. We move that with our feet and our heart. So I ask people all the time, what is it that you think? What is it that you feel? And what is it that you want to do? And allyship must have all of those things for me. So you can be thinking about, how do you want to show up in the world, and how do you currently show up in the world, whether that be your race, your gender, your sexuality, your disability, your location, your citizenship status, right? What are you feeling, right? So how are you expressing to folks that you are growing in allyship, that something has changed for you, that you are moved? And what are you doing, right? So like an actual tangible thing that goes beyond knowledge. So how are you either reinvesting or changing the access to money, power, and resources? That's like the key crux of organizing. How are you participating in that to make the lives of other folks that don't stand where you currently stand better? And so for me, it's all about really relationship. So your relationship to yourself, your relationship to others, and your relationship to the greater world. But there's also so much, but that's my definition. That's my definition of allyship. That's how I move with allyship.
To our relationship, yeah, I think so much of my work in empathy, like I talk a lot about that, just the way that we relate to ourselves, relate to people, and relate to the system. When I think about authentic allyship, though, there are three things that come up for me. And I think really all of this is about the outcomes that you would expect to see that shows some authenticity. I think we often focus on, when we talk about allyship, just this idea of like obviously the change we want to see, without folk thinking about what are the outcomes for myself. And so when I think about authentic allyship, I'm thinking about, does it increase your awareness? So it's like the first thing that I think about is like, all right, am I knowing something today that I didn't know before? And am I actually going after and seeking real things that like push me to be uncomfortable in spaces where I'm like, I really don't know anything? The second is behavior change. So is my behavior going to change after this thing that I have done? And I think this really gets into the conversation around like, you know, hacktivists or hashtag activism or slacktivism, this idea that if it's easy, it probably isn't authentic allyship. And you should question whether this thing that you have done is actually shifting anything for you, because change is hard, but that's the point. And then three is consistency. So we can do all of that, but if we're not actually changing a habit, and we're not thinking about this as building or cultivating a habit, then it's not authentic to me when I think about allyship. This is kind of how I frame like my ABCs of allyship. It's just like awareness, behavior change, and consistency. And I think why it's important is that I often think about how we look at medical practitioners who have to take this oath, the Hippocratic oath, where they're like, first, do no harm. It's like, that's like the minimum before you even start saving lives, or you actually put your practice or your experience to good use where you can like change the lives of people. They're like, look, at a minimum, I have to realize that there's a line that I can't cross, which is that this is going to make my patient worse off. And I think allyship is the same way. Part of this accountability is about, hey, like some of this is like good intentions are not always enough. In fact, it's often not enough, because good intentions can actually create more harm than the good. And so if you're going to use that title, or you're going to say, I'm here to show up as an ally, I have to hold you accountable to, and we have to hold ourselves accountable to that idea that it should actually just not do any harm to start.
Woo-hoo, y'all are fire. I mean, a couple mic drops. Brittany, you wanted to say something else to that?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to like note with what Corey said around habit, and I think that that's so important. I know Octavia Butler, my favorite science fiction writer, has this quote that I'm going to misquote, so I'm not going to quote it, but she talks about inspiration, and she basically says inspiration is BS. Like, we can be inspired all we want. It's not until we actually build habit. Habit is what is going to be with us every single day. So allyship gets to look like us brushing our teeth every single day. It's just we act from that place. It is the first thing we go to. We can be inspired. We can be, you know, moments like what happened this summer are going to come and go, but the habits are going to stay if we develop them. And so I like that, how you think about that, Corey. It's like, that's like super important.
Yeah, no, thanks for acknowledging that. And I would just say, like, yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned it about this summer, because I think when people were checking in with me about, like, what do you think? People are finally having this conversation. You must be excited. And I'm like, you know, I definitely feel like we should be having this conversation as a nation, as a world, and we should be like checking in on, like, hey, this does affect all of us. You know, Black lives do matter, and this is why the conversation is relevant to all of us. But what I'm more interested in is whether you actually stand up for that Black woman in meetings when she's consistently talked over. What I am interested in is that you don't cross the street whenever I'm walking down the sidewalk. You know, what are the decisions that you're making on a daily basis, the habits that you form that actually shape the way that you're going to see me or value anyone else who has been historically marginalized or underrepresented in spaces?
Woohoo! Oh my gosh. Y'all are so dope. Yeah. So from the habits to the ABCs about awareness, behavior, consistency, to relationships, the think, the feel, the do, the outcomes, and that show up. You know, this is a call out when it comes to allyship and being an accomplice. How do you show up? And not only just show up that one time, you're like, oh, that's cute, but showing up consistently, you're changing that. And I love too, Brittany, how you used it in the context of brushing our teeth. We know, you know, your breath, to get it right, you got to brush that teeth, right? You got to brush those teeth, and being sure that you are consistent and it shows on that reflection. And I love how you all, again, the relationships and reflection, and just that increase of awareness and that action and doing. And so in doing the work, right, there have been terms that have been created to support this inclusion. One of those terms is BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color. Do you all mind shedding a little light on the usage of that acronym? Corey, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks. So I think it's interesting, right? Whether it's BIPOC or it's even the conversation around allyship, that we create terms, I think, that have good intentions. Again, going back to like being well-intentioned, where there are cases in which it might be very valuable, right? Like we think often of problems, right? If you have a problem, you should first be able to name it and call it out as a problem. That's the only way you'll be able to do something with it. And the same with them being able to identify or have the conversation. So I think BIPOC has some value in being able to describe, like, hey, here is a community, here is a space, here's a group of people that we are going to talk about when we talk about these issues. The challenge that I think happens with many of these terms are that they maybe become co-opted in ways that make it easier for people to like move past like really diving deep or really diving into critical issues. And so by that, I mean, what I mean by co-opting is that we see that many terms, like whether it's people of color, whether it's BIPOC, whether it's ally, advocate, these are terms that might have been inspired by the movement, might have been inspired by the group that it was meant to describe, as a way to create solidarity within a community or a space, or to create some type of way to like identify, like, hey, these are the people that we can rely on and lean on in the movement. But then what it becomes is a catch-all term to say, like, hey, this is now as somebody who is not a part of that group, maybe is, you know, a person who is in a position of power, this is my way of being able to talk about this issue without having to talk about the ugliness of like what actually is embedded in each of these communities. So I can say BIPOC, I don't want to say Black Lives Matter. Or I can say, let's talk about BIPOC. I don't want to talk about the fact that within that community, there are very much nuances in all of the things that have happened to Black people, Indigenous people, other people of color just within this country. And so it's easier to just say BIPOC. Things happen to BIPOC people, and we can acknowledge that. So I think that it's a term that is relevant for having a general like framing of that there are people that have systemically been the victims of disadvantage, but it can also take away the nuance of talking about what that disadvantage is and make it easier for people to not own what those things are, like acknowledging slavery, acknowledging police brutality, acknowledging taking away the lands of, you know, indigenous communities that have, you know, been here, you know. And so I think it's easier to kind of ignore that.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that you've said. And again, like, I think, you know, like to the BIPOC, I learned BIPOC like 10 years, I don't know, 5 years ago, before it became like the Instagram hashtag and what made it into everyone's copy. And when I was like in spaces talking to people, it was the idea, or so the method behind it, was to separate out Black and Indigenous people in this sort of group or lump of people of color. And like Corey mentioned, the understandings of the experience of Black people in the United States, particularly in their experiences of anti-Blackness, their experiences of living in this country in the afterlife of slavery, their experiences of police violence, right? Indigenous folks, and the big issues around land sovereignty and genocide, and all of the experiences that Indigenous people have in this country that are different from other groups of people of color, right? And that are, and not to say that they are like, that all people of color don't experience some form of oppression, but really to name the particular experiences of anti-Blackness, of genocide, of all of the things that impact Black and Indigenous people. And I think when people use the acronym and first never spell it out, you don't see that. That doesn't become visual. Most people don't even know what the BI stands for in front of BIPOC, right? And so it sort of becomes another thing that's just added to our vocabulary. We get a hashtag for it, and then it makes a nice, cute abbreviation in our reports. And so I often want to remind people of sort of the intentions around that, and that there's an urge, I think, you know, even in these conversations of like, you know, in June, again, when a lot of people were taking to social media and like, we need to like listen to marginalized voices, of like, the message is, listen to Black people. Say it with me, Black with a capital B. Like, this is what we're talking about. Sometimes I don't understand, in the nation where we created race, why we can't talk and name race. I don't, it's like the biggest cognitive dissonance to me. But I think when you name a particular race, you also have to talk about power that's associated with a dominant group, right? So if you say Black, you have to say white. And I think that for some people that's really comfortable. And so, you know, my invitation is for folks to spell it out, like, say what you mean, you know, don't, you know, like, this program is for minorities. I'm like, people that eat apples and bananas with like mayonnaise, like, is that a minority group? What are you talking about? Right? Like, be specific, name it. We want to be seen in your hashtags, in your posts. We want to be made visible. And I think sometimes the use of acronyms, even BIPOC, make us further invisible, and not always done intentionally, but it can become the norm.
Woo, I got goosebumps. Oh my gosh. Oh, it's, yo, yes. Oh, okay. Let me take a moment, because I'm receiving, and the processing, the process, you know, like the woo-sa, right? Because again, this is a conversation to push the envelope out of the level of being comfortable, and also to call out these things, right? So from BIPOC, and understanding that specifically for PowerPlay, serves a number of youth of color, of girls of color, and gender non-conforming youth. And understanding too about that specificity though, calling it out, the value that's associated with it, to not do a general framing all the time, and to really, really get to the root of it, especially for our young people, as we talk about identity, as we talk about the transition from race and gender. So how have you all seen the interplay between gender and race, inequality, impact potential growth of youth of color?
Well, I just want to hop in here because, I mean, what you just said about identity development, I think is how this relates, like this question that you asked, because I think as we think about inequality and we think about the lines of race and gender and that intersectionality, I think one thing that I see with youth is that there's actually, like, along those dimensions, this inability to be free to fail, right? We think about, you know, growing up as a kid and there's really some innocence associated with it, but then you throw in a layer of race and there's less innocence assumed. And then you throw in like the intersection of race and gender, and then there's like this idea like you have to grow up really, really fast in order to be a strong, you know, woman of color, Black woman, you know, Latinx woman in this world. And so it's like this hard reality of where we look at it as like this moniker of like a strong Black woman, or a strong woman of color, but you actually that takes away a lot of the innocence that you get to kind of play in as a kid if you're not having to deal with that inequality or that intersectionality. And then I think what that does for the identity development of kids at or youth at such a young age is that like they're having to adopt things that maybe they would not necessarily have to adopt in the formation of their identity. So Black must mean X. Being a Black man must mean X because I've been, conditioned to see Black women this way. So then I treat Black girls this way because this is how I'm conditioned to be as a Black boy. So I think that identity development then becomes framed by this inequality. And then ultimately the boundaries that are set, which is like the crazy thing with inequality, right? Like you're both like, especially if you are from any of these intersections of race and gender, like you are both impacted by the way you are perceived and you also can perpetuate it, right? And so you set the boundaries because, or you are bound by these different things that inequality and race and gender present. And then you also perpetuate it because that's all you know. As a kid, you learn to believe that this is how this is the only way that I can show up within this narrow framing, or this is the only way that I can see my fellow youth and my fellow classmates or whoever, because this is how it's been framed to me, and not really being able to see an identity outside that.
Yes, the identity piece is huge, and I think that we also play a huge role in shaping how young people experience their value based on what we value. And so I think in particular when we think about social justice movements, and I'll take Black Lives Matter for example. I think a lot of people know about BLM but don't know that it was like founded by Black women or Black queer women, and they are erased from the origin story of that narrative. And that's not done by accident. That is done, intentionally at some point, right? Because as me, a person who works alongside Black girls and other girls of color all the time in doing organizing and leadership, it means something to see yourself in those roles. But how would we see ourselves in a movement where people have erased us, right? And that's like, that goes way back. We can think about Diane Nash. We can think about lots of folks who were at the front, Ella Baker, at the front lines of movements. Claudette Colvin, who was one of the first people, a young girl who was sitting on the bus before Rosa Parks ever sat on the bus. But she wasn't respectable, right? She was a dark girl. She was she wasn't a part of the NAACP. She wasn't affiliated. No one showed up for her. And so the stories of people like Claudette Colvin, her specific intersections of race and gender and how that played out for her, she never became the Rosa Parks story. And why that matters to me is that I consistently think about young girls and how they see themselves in the world and what stories get uplifted and which ones don't. And I think that there's this, like, for a long time there's been this idea that the girls are doing okay. When people talked about education injustice, when people talked about healthcare, it was the girls are doing all right. Philanthropy for a long time had the same idea that the girls are doing all right. They were in the same classrooms as Black and Latinx boys, but they were doing all right. They graduated, oh yes, they're graduating at higher rates, but struggling in college, the girls are doing all right. They have multiple gender-specific burdens to go home to. They don't get to play on the soccer team because they have to go babysit, but the girls are doing all right. They experience sexual harassment in the hallways, but boys will be boys, the girls are doing all right. And so I'm bringing this home because this idea that the girls are doing all right has really erased the particular ways in which race and gender impact their lives, and make invisible their real experiences, right? That, like, my identity, I only get to play part of my identity today. So today I get to play girl, but not race. Today I get to play race, but not girl, or gender. And if you're a gender non-conforming young person, the layers are even bigger, right? Because you're being asked to put yourself in a specific box and not make your life growing up any harder. And so I think, in particular for me, I'm always thinking about the ways in which we lift up the experiences of girls of color in the classroom and medical systems and social service systems, because there's been a long history of the erasure and the particular ways in which they experience both racism and sexism at the same time, right? And they need to see themselves in the movement. They need to see themselves as important. And if we don't reflect that back to them, then they won't see it, right? And so it means a lot for me not to erase sort of the importance of both race and gender are playing out here. And then it plays out really big in policy. I mean, Kimberly Crenshaw coined intersectionality as a way of looking at both race and gender and the law, and how Black women were experiencing race and gender and the law at the same time, which was not being shown in other legal cases, right? And so I think that when we think about policy, when we think about spaces and places, we also have to think about the particular ways in which multiple identities and intersecting identities show up.
Man, can I just quickly want to drop a resource. And when you set that up, Brittany, about erasure, I just thought there's this podcast that I've been listening to called There Are No Girls on the Internet. And what's so interesting about this podcast is that they literally talk about that, whatever it is, climate injustice, Black Lives Matter, the blackout, hashtag Blackout Day, Netflix cuties, all of this stuff, right? They talk about how Black women, how women of color are erased from these conversations on the internet, where something gets sparked and there's a viral movement, and we forget where the creativity, where the impetus, where the, movement started from. So I'll just say that is it's a great podcast if you're interested in diving more deeply into that conversation.
Thank you. And I love that resource, right? And being able to talk about the lives of our Black girls and gender nonconforming youth, the lives of the girls, right? And Brittany, I love how you use that example of she can't go to soccer practice because she got to go babysit, right? And thinking about too how PowerPlay promotes that play, girls playing, having fun, getting like silly, getting active, and what that brings. And speaking about our youth and youth development, the next piece is, and for the purposes of this conversation and using BIPOC or, our girls and gender nonconforming youth of color, want to know how to show up for them, right? So whether that's in youth development, higher education, so that includes university, education counselors, scholarship resources, and career, the corporate professionals. How can we as humans show up for the babies?
I can start us off. So, I mean, my first thing is always listen to girls of color, gender nonconforming youth of color. And when I say listen, I mean create intentional practices where you can listen. So if you are planning something on behalf of girls of color and gender nonconforming young people, they should be at the table giving you feedback. No different than if you were to send out a survey after a meeting. And so it's important for their voices, because anything that you do is inextricably linked to their lives, right? And so I often say that when we are making, whether that's policy program, building an internship program, anything like that, we need to have girls of color and gender nonconforming young people at the table. And not at the table later, not at the table after, at the table during. So, part of the implementation, evaluation, and design of anything that you build on behalf of them and for them. And so I like to say all the time, I build with and alongside. I don't build for. And so that's one of the things. The other things are young folks need to see themselves in the work, right? And so I think that it matters that when we are, creating programs, or like for me, I come from a youth development space. When we're creating programs or creating policies, young people need to understand that one day they can also do that job. And so, they need to see themselves on the board, and they need to see themselves in the staffing, space, right? Like there needs to be a person that they can look to and say, one day I can be in this job. It's not that far fetched, right? For me. And I think another way is to remove barriers, especially those that that are particularly biased in terms of race and gender. And so what I will say is I show up as a Black woman who once was a Black girl everywhere, right? I have green hair today. I have a petty-like shirt on. I have, nails. I have all of these things. And it's really important for me to show up this way in spaces because especially for Black girls and lots of girls of color, Latinx girls too, they are policed and surveilled in so many spaces around their physical appearance. Girls of color in New York City have some of the highest dress code violations, and it's one of the main reasons why they are pushed out of school, why they don't continue education. They're either suspended or something like that, just for what they wear to school. And, you know, it's hard when we have like an idea, you know, I get this question all the time, but like, what about professionalism? And I'm like, yeah, but who kind of created professionalism? Like, who sets the norm? We need to interrogate who sets the norm for professionalism. My hair is never going to be straight. It does not grow out my head like that. And when I do straighten it, I'm changing it to be closer to another norm, right? And so like we need to be able to be in question. And so for me, I've collected all the degrees already. I've already got the job. I'm showing up like this so that people can see that this is possible. There's something possible about it. Do people have feelings? Absolutely. I don't care. You know, I'm willing to take that risk because it depends, like another Black girl looking at me, it depends on that, right? And so I often say, like, we need to remove barriers, whether that's removing dress codes from certain activities or events, thinking about language, right? And like, how accessible are we becoming? Do we change our language and our posture to be different, to appear, you know, different in space? Or are we real? Do we talk with young people that look like us, like we talk? Or do we change that? You know, I think that those are some real important places. And then the last is just to give young people, invest in young people in really big, bold ways consistently. And that, you know, again, the shifting of money, power, and resources is what's really important. So like if you're giving to PowerPlay or you're giving to another organization that supports the lives of girls of color, that's important. Because like I said, philanthropy just woke up like 5 years ago. They just were like, oh, the girls are not okay, right? Individual donors matter. Like, and sometimes it means giving directly to girls themselves. And it doesn't mean, you know, I think we saw there's a Cash App generation where they just literally have, you know, they're like, listen, this is who I am. I gave you some knowledge here, pay me for this. And so I think that, you know, that's another thing is to like also pay and honor people's labor. Because whether a young girl or, you know, a woman or whatever, there's a lot of labor that is being done and it's not paid for. And so those are like my first steps of like how we can really start to move towards true allyship on behalf and with girls of color and gender nonconforming young people.
Woo, go ahead, Corey.
Drop that knowledge. Especially love that you talk about authenticity, because I think it's something that, like you said, as a professional and starting to move into that space of like I'm cultivating my identity as a working professional, I am learning more and more that it does matter if I choose to grow my hair out as opposed to wear a professional style, or it does matter that I am okay wearing, you know, colorful pieces of clothing because that's who I am, because I think it represents the fact that it is okay, it is professional, I can do this job. So I love that you said that. I'm just going to do 3 quick things to just plus on to what Brittany said. I think in the youth development space, really, what can you do to create safe spaces? I think safe spaces are so important at that age. And like, if you're doing that work and interfacing every day to make, again, youth feel safe to fail or to have problems, have challenges and move through it. I think if you're talking about higher education or even education in general, it's like, what are you doing to cultivate curiosity? So your programming and the way that you think about like engaging with youth should be centered on like exposure, awareness, exploration, like all of these ideas of like, I'm not going to tell you what to do or what you should know. I'm going to give you the space to figure that out for yourself and reward that. And then I think in the career conversation and the corporate conversation, it's really a conversation around pipeline development. I think it's something that too often corporations or companies don't actually think is their responsibility, because they're thinking, well, once they get here, or like the parents should have done the work, or the school system should have done the work. So it is up to those institutions to get them into our doors, and then we hire them and we do all of this stuff as employees. But I think it starts before that. I think if you're in the corporate space and you're thinking about how can I serve youth, and really think about this conversation of being an ally to youth, marginalized youth, it's pipelines. Like, how are you going into the communities that you are headquartered in and really making that investment? Not because it's going to look good for you as a company, but literally because, look, 5th graders should be exposed to technology. Or look, this school, they should know that this is an industry that exists in their area. They shouldn't have that, you know, they should know that there's something outside of the neighborhood that they live in that they could go see or do or understand or cultivate these relationships very early with corporate professionals. So those are my 3 things for those different spaces.
Whoa. Okay, so a quick playback. So Brittany, I appreciate all that authenticity that showed up. You just started with your hands. You like, look, here's what we're talking about for the representation. Just so y'all clear, I got all the degrees and receipts and the reason why it, you know, so that I want to acknowledge that because it's true in the representation and the value and working with and alongside our young people, not for them, because we have to bring them to the table. And also to kind of throw it back to something that was said earlier around we want to be seen because we've been made invisible, so we want to be made visible. And Corey, that pipeline development, game changing. And thinking about how that works for the responsibility of corporations. It is your responsibility. If you want to be able to advance these young people of color who are representing and they're an asset to your company, yo, you got to give them something, the resources for that development and doing the work. And I want to just acknowledge that because it takes the confidence, it takes the awareness, but it also takes that representation to be, as you said, Corey, safe to fail. It's okay. Because through exposure, awareness, and exploration, they can fail and then get back up. And that kind of level of kind of keep going and going. So when we think about these youth development programs, when we think about higher education and career, all y'all who are paying attention to this, understand it is your responsibility to create the space to support them to be great. And that inclusion exists. I mean, we could keep going and going and going and going. But of course, time. And so thinking about time, I'm gonna throw it over to the chat. And we have some amazing questions where folks who are here, again, thank you for showing up and being present and participating, have questions. So the first question is, what are words, phrases, and actions that I can use as an ally that will create a safe, welcoming environment when engaging in conversation with casual acquaintances? Is it appropriate to ask how they would like to be referred to? Black, African American, white, Asian, Latinx, etc.?
Yeah, I can jump in here. So I think that so what I would say is that I think it's definitely from my background or thinking about empathy, I would say yes, the answer is, I think that it's okay, because I think that what we're really doing right now is that we're acknowledging that you don't have all the answers. And so I think that you should be very open to, asking how somebody wants to be referred to, for instance, or, not just assuming that you know somebody's experience. But I'm hesitating and I'm moving around the question a little bit, just because I think what also comes up is that when we think about just the history of different communities and different experiences that people have when they are marginalized, when they are erased, when they feel invisible, part of that is both having to do the work of being resilient in those spaces, and then also having to explain over and over and over again why that's important to them, or why it's important to be seen, or why it's important to be visible. So I think it's a line that we have to make sure that we're not where you're sincerely asking because you're hey, I really want to know how you show what your experience is, as opposed to crossing that line of hey, I want you to educate me on this thing so that I may go out into the world amongst other people like you and do good work. I think that there's a responsibility we have to have for ourselves to do some of that education where we can. And then when we have specific questions about the individual, if you're talking to me, Corey, how do I show up versus not how Corey, the Black man, what I think Black men want to be referred to as or seen as or talked to about.
Yeah, I feel like I was hesitant around sort of the answer in the same way, because I think something else that happens is, especially in times when people want to be moved to allyship, whenever they see a person of color, the only question that they have for them is about that specific thing. So I can't tell you in the summer the amount of times that I'd be in the supermarket and be like, hey, what do you think about the protest? Hey, like, what can I, and it's like, yo, can we just talk about this kale? Because I want to know if you saw this kale yesterday and is it fresh for me to have? Like, we also get to be full human beings participating in the same society. And so when I name and land that we want also authentic relationships, one of the ways to be a good ally is to be authentic as a person. So not be on the, like, I have to have the best calculated racial justice question when I approach a Black person. Perhaps just being, moving through the world with empathy, as Corey, tells us about, like, and just understanding that people have personhood and that people are regular, right? Before we have to do all this other stuff. And there's so much labor in answering those questions. And we are resilient because we've been answering them our whole lives. But to me, it's often refreshing when I get to learn about the kale, like when I get to not have to be on and not have to be educator, intellectual, etc. Like, this moment in which I'm choosing to do this work is important. And also there are times when folks want to just be able to be a full participant in the world. And so if you wouldn't, go up in a grocery store and ask a person like, hey, what do you think about the first question out your mouth is like, what do you think about the things that are happening on TV right now? I don't think that you should also orient to be that way with a person of color. And with relationship, you will learn things about people. And I often say, like, learn things about the South. Specifically for white folks, you also have a racial and ethnic identity. You come from someplace, right? Like, you just didn't drop here. And so I think sometimes there's no exchange, right? Like, Melissa, who's my friend and invited me to be on this panel, our first year of friendship was me learning about what it meant to be Portuguese, right? Like, you're not just a white person, you're a person from a place. And for me, being a Black person that's from the Caribbean in the US. And so there was some exchange in understanding how we come to be in this place and not just a singular extraction. And that's really important in action.
I love it. Thank you both for that. And also shout out to Melissa, who played a huge role, a part of the team in setting up this conversation as well. So shout out to you, Melissa. So the next question is, and I'm going to read it verbatim. You talked a little bit about how Black, queer, or gender nonconforming people are often the ones who create the organizations and spaces for inclusivity, but often get erased and even marginalized in those spaces. How do we combat that? Especially when they are often expected to do the hard lifting for everyone else while they are forgotten or left behind.
Yeah, I'll say one quick thing about that is, like, if you are thinking about that question and you are in a position of power or influence in, like, an organization or a space where that is happening, I think the one thing that I would say is that, how do you actually make it a part of the system to reward that type of work? And so I think that oftentimes in a corporate space, like, again, it's like a thankless job, because it's like, well, we expect all of the people, the employee resource groups here that focus on, these issues or building community in these spaces to care about this. So, like, they do that on top of their jobs. Or, like you said, it's created out of necessity, but then that necessity is not treated like a business line item or a business goal, or like the same way that you think about profit margins or like product launches. And so I think, like, if you're asking that question, it's like, what are the actual systems, the institutional, like, culture that you have built around performance, around rewards, around pay, that can actually, like, make that something that is valued? Because then what will happen, guarantee it, is that the culture will shift around who sees that work as valuable. So I think there's a moral imperative. Absolutely, it is morally imperative to do this work, and we should show up to it. But if we're thinking about changing the system, how do you incentivize that so that there are people who understand that, yes, like, it is a moral imperative, and also, I know that my company values this. So me as a white man, I also will invest this time. I will sponsor this organization. I will, take time off from my 2:00 meetings to go to this event and actually show up and volunteer. Like, how do you actually shift the culture around, is it valuable to people who's not directly impacted? And I put that in quotes because we're all impacted by inequality. We just might not see it or wear it as directly.
Oops. Yes. And to just add a little bit onto that, I think one of the ways that happens and people become invisible in their work is through co-optation, but also through it becomes sexy, for lack of a better word. It becomes, I mean, sexy is a good word, but it becomes popular in the minds of so many people. And when we have mechanisms for where we could keep the people who created the thing at the center, we just don't use them. There's coalition, groups working together. There's partnership, groups working together. There's consultation, right? So like I've seen in many of my experiences, I've seen people start a program or start a thing for a specific group of people, and no one who's in the directing knows any of that, knows nothing, right? But then they have to, like, they do all the reading, they become an expert, and they still are not an expert because they don't move through the world in that way. When they could just simply call up the experts, right? And have them be the people that do the leading, do the facilitating, right? Do the work, right? But it requires that you acknowledge that, right? That you acknowledge that you are not the expert. And I think that allyship mostly also best functions when people that have power are working with other people that have power, right? That are changing and shifting the mindsets of other people that are also more like them than different, right? Because it's great to be an ally to me, to check in on me, tell me how I'm doing, all of those things. But it really works when people are talking across the same kinds of lines, when we're coaching each other to be different and be better, and holding each other accountable. And so I think that, like, no one becomes invisible if we are using partnership, if we're using coalition, if we are, putting people at the center, moving them to the center. Like, hey, I got this big, thing, this big grant to do this thing. Can you be a sub-grantee for me? Because this is your work. I want to continue to lift you up in this work. And I think that's how that's one of the ways we prevent that from happening and occurring. And hashtag cite Black women, because that's a real thing.
Shout out to that. So much is happening right now, and the inspiration and the movement to go forward. So we have about 4 more minutes for this last piece, and I want to make sure that these 2 questions get answered from our guests, our attendees. So I'm going to say them both, and then you all can be able to answer them if you feel. So Corey, you mentioned that there is an innocence associated with youth. So kids are not born prejudiced, they are taught. So around what age do you suggest to start having these conversations with youth? So I'm gonna hold that. The second one is, at times it can feel exhausting to have to constantly be the person to educate potential allies on what's appropriate, helpful, etc. How do you strike a balance between being a resource to help educate others for the movement and having allies hold themselves accountable and take more initiative?
Cool. So I would say on the first, to answer them both. So the first question is interesting. There was an article I read, I think it was in the Reader's Digest like years ago, but they talked about this very question, right? Because parents would often, like, they were essentially saying that kids as early as like kindergarten, as soon as they go into an environment where they're mixing with other kids or youth, are going to start asking questions. And just because they're asking questions is not like a substitute, their youth is not a substitute for naivety or a lack of comprehension. And so when they say something like, why is Joey the color of this brown crayon and I'm the color of this, like, peach crayon, even if you answer it or you avoid it by saying like, oh no, like, you and Joey are not different at all, like y'all are both the same, the kids will be like, okay, like that's obviously not true because he's a brown crayon and I'm a peach crayon. And like your unwillingness to answer it or your hesitance around it has sent me a signal where I don't know what that means. I don't know what the word racism means. I don't know what prejudice means, but I know that Joey definitely is different, and that's an awkward conversation. So now I know that my parents think that, like, I have associated awkwardness to this thing that I have noticed is different. And so to answer that question, I feel like as soon as you're getting the questions, because I think if you're a parent or if you're in a space where you're mentoring youth or you're talking to youth, they're asking you the questions, it's like they have noticed that something is different. And what we can't do is like pretend that uniqueness doesn't exist, that we can't pretend like these conversations aren't shaping the way that we are going to move through the world. And then on the second question, I would say, and I think this is really where the responsibility for allies and like being comfortable being confronted with difficult feedback or the uncomfortable truths of, you know, realizing that you're not as aware or as woke as you might think you are at any given time, is like really acknowledging that this work is difficult for, you know, any marginalized group, like as they move through both reconciling who they have to be in order to survive in this world and hoping for change or hoping for progress and hoping that things can get better. And so I think that if you're in that position where you're feeling worn out, it's like really, you know, if you don't feel like you have allies around you, really being comfortable just like timing out, like finding a community of solidarity and support and backing away from the work and being able to just say like, you know, I'm just not in a position where I can do that or answer that or do this work right now. But then actually hopefully finding allies or finding communities like around you where people can understand that like, hey, like you need to tap out and I'm going to support you in that and do my best to like do that education piece for you as best as I can. I think that there's some element of it where, you know, I definitely feel like the information is out there. And so the flippant answer would be to Google it. But I think that there's like the more like the real reality where I think that it is hard to tell people no. And so how do you move through that? I think it's by acknowledging like, hey, like I'm tired. Like it's not about me being unwilling to help you. It's like, this is tiring.
I love that. And that tiredness. Brittany?
Yeah, I think Corey spoke to, I was actually going to tell a similar story about the first question. So you hit it on the head, Corey. And yeah, the second question, I think it's okay to name. I have a draft email in my inbox that I send out when I am actually really tired of participating in conversations that I think are hard. And I also think that like, I mean, for me as a person who does consulting work on this, I often, you know, I'm in an interesting place because this is literally my job. And I often have to explain to people that this is my job. And so, you know, when there are questions, you know, we live in a world where there are things like executive coaching, where there's leadership coaching, where you want to be coached to be a better leader. So when you have sort of these questions, sometimes there is like a resource that it's a resource that's not free. It's a resource that's not, you know, untimely. Like, it's, you know, I think sometimes people come to me and they're like, I have a quick question, but you've been thinking about this question for 4 days. So it's not a quick question. It's going to take me more time to answer that question if you've been thinking about it. And so I often ask people to really think about the time that it would take for the person that you want to get the answer from to answer the question, right? And like, what else could they be doing in that time? Right? Or what else are you doing? What else are you doing with that time? Is it, you know, are they eating dinner while they answer these questions? Again, I think it's about, for me, it's the exchange. And like what all the power that is like, you know, constantly sucked out with having to explain. But for me, it's a knee jerk. I'm born to educate, and I wake up with an orientation to change the world. So I'm always doing this work, but I've learned to say no. And I've learned to say not right now. And that was like a muscle that I had to build, you know, because I felt like I was doing the world a disservice. But I decided that I also needed to be here. You know, it was taking a toll on my mental health. And without me, then, you know, what am I going to do if I don't have myself? So I think the muscle is to build a no. And when you feel it, just say it. And you can be unapologetic about that, because there is Google. There's a wealth of information on the internet, right? And there are other people. And I think that's also the role of allies. When allies get all the way up there and they feel like they got it, that's their job to step in. That's their job to be in the comment section responding, not you, someone else on your behalf.
Oh, all of this, it's like we could continue to go and go, but because we want to make sure that we respect your time and the time of our attendees, I'm going to have to pause this conversation, never to stop us from being great. Corey and Brittany, y'all are absolutely dope-tastic. Hey, yo, attendees, do me a favor and just drop some love in the chat real quick. Go ahead, just drop it. And I want to throw this out before we close out. Brittany, an attendee asked, where could they get the Petty Light shirt from? So if you don't mind dropping that in the chat for them to be able to, you know, use that resource. This has been such a valuable conversation in talking about the ABCs: awareness, behavior, consistency, think, do, feel. It looks like we lost Brittany. She might join back before we close out. There she is. Shout out to the internets. And having those good intentions and showing up and being responsible to shift the culture, especially for our girls and gender nonconforming youth of color. It starts with you, the accountability, saying yes. Don't just talk about it, be about it. Showing up and doing the work, as Brittany said earlier, choosing to do the work. And also acknowledging for those of you who have been doing the work that it's okay for you to be tired. Name it, have the balance. And as this conversation continues on, we're going to follow up with an email to know what Corey and Brittany are up to, along with the recording attached, because we want to make sure that you're continuing this conversation, holding yourself accountable and other people accountable as well. Also, here's another thing. Donate, mentor, volunteer to these organizations like PowerPlay and other organizations that truly serve our girls of color. Donate directly to any girls and gender nonconforming youth of color. Donate your time, donate your space, and donate your presence. You are appreciated. Thank you again, Brittany and Corey. I'm so sorry. Thank you, Brittany and Corey, for having this conversation and opening up your time to say yes to us. We appreciate you. We say yes to you, and we appreciate the work that you do. It's been a pleasure. I'm your girl, Shantae J. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.